Hello, and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in work and in life and simplify them. And friends, we've been really diving deep into leadership and culture strategy, simplifying the topics for employee experience, leadership development, and those at the very, very top that make scalable changes across your enterprise. And it's nice, actually, because you get to peek behind the Wizard of Oz curtain and see how things are done. And you have probably taken an assessment or two in your lifetime when you were getting hired. And, assessments are great for people who work in call centers. Do you know if they've got the patience to, handle customer service things in big crisis moments? But we're going to focus in on executive assessments. That's right. The assessments that your C-suite, your senior leaders, your VPs are taking in order to get hired and be the right fit for the organization. So what we're simplifying today is how to use executive assessments to hire smarter. And my special guest today, his name is Brandon Jordan. He's an organizational psychologist and the founder of ForPsyte Talent Assessments, bringing nearly 20 years of experience in applied research, people analytics, and psychometrics to the world of talent management and employee engagement. He leverages data-driven strategies to help organizations hire smarter, develop their workforce, and build high-performing cultures. So I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast, Brandon Jordan. Hey, Brandon.
Hey, Mary. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. And I want to nerd out about this. So I'm excited about this conversation with you today. I want to talk about, first and foremost, when you think of an executive assessment, we're not talking about a Myers-Briggs or maybe even what Harry Potter house are you in? But what should an executive assessment actually tell you?
Yeah, when I think about executive assessment, I think of it as more of not an individual assessment. It's more of a battery, multiple methodologies brought to bear to assess different components of an individual. And sometimes that match to the organization. Sometimes there's some measurement with regard to culture, job fit, and things like that too, that you measure on the environment side, let's say.
Yeah.
But I think about it in terms of more of a process, identify the person that's going to be the best for the role, or give some evidence and some information and make the best decision. And to a certain degree, I believe most executive assessments, jump the shark in a way. They could do a little bit too much, but part of that is needed. But also part of it is, part of the process, and making the candidate feel the weight of the importance of their role as they're being selected, as they're going through the process too, But at its core, it can be multiple methodologies, and it depends on what level in the organization we're talking about. Where is that targeted leader at, right? So,
well, let's face it, if you're hiring the CEO for your organization, that is a high stakes, one person job versus, say, a call center, which, is high volume. You might have hundreds of hires in a month or two, but you got to get it right because that person ripples out to all areas of the organization and its future success or failure. No big deal, right?
Yeah, no big deal. Critical, right? And, I often compare doing any sort of employee assessment to if anybody's ever bought a house. A lot of people bought a car, at least, right? You want to test drive the car. You want to make sure that you're going to make this right financial decision, especially for a house. Imagine you are going to buy a house and they only allow you to do a 30-minute home inspection. You have a lot of confidence in that home inspection report, right? So on the executive level, you want a real thorough kind of look under the hood at these individuals to make sure that not only they're going to be good for the role, are they going to be successful? Are they going to just roll over people to get the job done and have some toxic behaviors and things like that too? So it's critical because their work and their output impacts so many other people in your organization.
That's right. So there's behavioral traits, there's situational judgment, cognitive ability. Tell us more about these different parts of an executive assessment.
Yeah. So one mainstay, really solid finding from the psychological and management research on assessments in general is using multiple methodologies maximally increases your chance of getting it right, right? Now, are you going to spend a day assessing a fry cook at a fast food chain to get it right? Probably not. That's not very practical, but the more tools you use generally produces overall better correlation with getting that higher right and correlating with their future performance. So that can be personality, behavioral based assessments. It can be cognitive ability, numerical reasoning, for example. It can be situational judgment tests. For what they call broadly assessment center testing is what we often will apply for leaders. It can include a lot of these things. In addition, some real world role play exercises with a psychologist like myself, like a fictional scenario, and you're presented with a problem and have to meet with, your boss. I'll play a role as their boss, perhaps, or a coworker or a subordinate, and rate them on how they handled the situation across various competencies and things like that. So, there's so many ways that we can go in and assess somebody. Internally, you have 360 assessments. So like, how do they behave in the workplace from their reputational aspect of those things, right? How does their boss perceive them? How do their peers perceive them? How their subordinates perceive them in terms of their personality and competence at work? So many methodologies that can come into play. To a certain degree, though, after 3 or 4 assessments, there's diminishing returns in how well we're able to predict. So more is better to an extent. And then you're getting into the realm of, okay, we're probably not able to predict the performance as well. But a lot of times, some of those additional assessments are needed to ascertain what I was talking about earlier. Like, are they going to fit in here, though? We can probably got it right that they're going to be a good performer, but are they going to mesh with the team? Are they going to mesh with kind of how our culture might be different? And so some additional assessment to ascertain some of those things is sometimes warranted as well and helpful.
And I also wonder, depending on where the company is in their phase of change management or transformation as well, because there are certain times where you really need a very headstrong, decisive leader to, basically create the vision and build off of that. And sometimes you need a bit more of a collaborative leader who is open to feedback and does things in a more democratic way as well. Again, depending on where they're at in their change management and their transformation process is going to affect the type of leader you slot in. Because you may have aspirations of like, we want to be not a mom and pop shop that just sort of does things willy-nilly. We want to get things done and be drivers and da-da-da-da-da. But if he or she is the only driver or in a whole boardroom of, more democratic, soft, passive, kind people, they're going to fail, right? Because they need more people on the boat that, works and looks and thinks like them, right?
Perhaps, right. And so, we're getting into the realm of like, okay, what does the psychological makeup of a leadership team look like too, right? Yeah. What does that diversity look like? Overwhelmingly, I just wrote a blog that ties into this a little bit. It's like, what predicts leadership emergence versus leadership effectiveness? There's considerable overlap there, but there's some differences. And usually what you see whenever you're assessing a leadership team, let's say, is you see a lot of extroverted, strong-willed, maybe at times disagreeable, tough-minded people tend to ascend to the top ranks. And that's kind of anecdotally a pattern I've seen, but also it's through meta-analysis. We know this, that the more boisterous, extroverted people, there's a lot of other like predictors that go into that as well, but those kind of people may not always work well together. And so what does that team look like with you have large contingent of them being like that? They might butt heads with each other, right? Might not be as a smooth of a team. But to have some diversity in terms of behavior patterns can also create conflict. But what we also know from the team's research is a little bit of conflict is good and important because you iterate on failures and you argue with each other to a certain degree to get it right for the client or for the product or whatever that is.
Right. That's how you innovate.
100%. How you get better, right? One other thing is like what's really difficult for leadership, and you kind of touched on this, is like, what type of organization are you hiring the leader into? Are they going through a transformation? We are really good as biopsychologists at assessing for a very specific job role lower in the organization, where we can really define the tasks. You take, accountant versus bartender. What do we know about this? Just from your own knowledge of those roles, detail orientation is going to be really important for an accountant. Sociability and gregariousness, being outgoing, is going to be more important for a bartender. So when we do our analysis on these roles, we can determine from a personality behavioral pattern standpoint, typically you're going to get higher scores of detail orientation associated with higher scores of performance for accountants. Mm-hmm. And then same thing for the bartender, right? The sociability and performance. It's so much harder for leadership because we can get enough data on accountants in that specific role and really understand what that role looks like. Leadership role across organizations, across industries, it's almost a sample size issue, Mm-hmm. If we could get 1,000 airline CEOs and assess them, we can get a pretty good base rate at what's going to take to be successful for that. Unfortunately, there's just not that many people for us to really get a good base rate on what good looks like for an airline CEO, right? So we're kind of tied to what does it take in general to be a good CEO across industry? If we can get industry specific with some of those things at lower leadership levels, that's wonderful. But at the highest rungs, it's really tough. What does it take to be a good marketing executive across industry or within industry? Tough to get that data in one organization. So let's talk about then some frameworks that you use and trust the most to, find these types of leaders that are at this level. I know you've told me about the 3 C's. Can you break that down for us and simplify it? Yeah. So we're talking about validity of an assessment, right? And so I talk about the 3 C's. Validity is a unitary thing. What we're talking about is different signs of evidence of validity. Mm-hmm. And that is content validity, construct validity, and criterion validity. And so content validity is you're reading a list of personality traits associated with detail orientation. You can stick with them. And the items seem to align with statements aligned to detail-oriented behavior. It's face validity. It seems that stuff is going to be indicative of somebody's detail orientation in the real world. It could be numerical reasoning, for example, used to help hire an accountant. That content seems to match the job, right? Then you have construct validity, especially within the personality research domain. We have the most empirically based personality model. It's called the 5-factor model of personality, or the Big 5. They call it the Big 5. Most research, when they look at behavior, it can be condensed down to kind of 5 overall traits. Our own personality model actually has 6, but it's aligned to the Big 5. So Big 5 is OCEAN is the acronym: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism or emotional stability, depending upon how you talk about it. And then those all have subfacets to them. Behavior is very complex, but essentially whenever we give people a huge amount of behavioral items in a survey or an assessment, and then we crunch the numbers on that, and we figure out statistically, how do all these items cluster together? Mm-hmm. What items are related to each other? What we find is the underlying structure of that mathematical relationship, the statistical relationship, how the variance clusters together, it emerges into this model of the big five, essentially, with subfacets underneath it, right? Extroversion, oftentimes, there's two main subfacets, perhaps, under that of dominance and sociability, right? How assertive are you socially, and how just what quantity of sociability are you comfortable with, right? And so we were able to determine that construct validity through these mathematical means. The third level is criterion-related validity, where if we're going to use this assessment, what for? What is it going to do for us? What is it related to? In the world of employee talent assessments, what we're trying to do is use the measurement for the assessment, correlate, or draw out a predictive model of job performance, for turnover, for those sorts of outcomes. Can we determine whether this is going to improve our quality of hire based upon doing this? I mean, even simplifying and saving time on the interview process, right? Can we properly screen and produce better performing interview candidates? Can we predict whether they're going to get out of training quickly? All of these things have been researched, and we have a substantial amount of evidence that we can predict all of these things using employee assessments, essentially. The tough thing is, it's a bit of a Wild West market with employee assessments out there. And almost every company will say, our assessment is valid. And they're not lying, but they're talking about that first form at minimum of content validity, right? And that's great, Even there's an online Harry Potter assessment, right, that you can take. It's a bit of a behavioral-based assessment. It's kind of cool, but it sorts you into one of the houses of Harry Potter. There's some validity to that. It broadly describes kind of who you are. Would I use it to hire somebody? No, right? There's no evidence that it's correlating with any sort of performance or anything like that. And I would estimate only probably like 10 to 20% of assessments on the market have that third most sophisticated bucket where they do a good job of actually supplying the evidence that their assessments are actually correlated and predictive of some of those outcomes.
So what about Hogan? What are your thoughts on the Hogan assessments that are out there?
I'm a Hogan fan. I'm certified in the Hogan assessments. I'm also biased a bit. I went to the University of Tulsa for grad school, where Bob Hogan was the program chair with his wife, Joyce, for a really long time. I arrived at the grad school after he already left and had Hogan assessments up and running. They're out of Tulsa as well. But, in grad school, I was in the research lab that helped them develop their cognitive ability assessment. We reviewed a lot of that content and helped them with that. So in general, I'm a pretty big fan of their core assessment suite, right? So they have the HPI, MVPI, and HDS. I think it's a great tool, especially at the leadership level. It's a little overkill to use all three of those for lower level stuff and things like that. But I think from a leadership assessment standpoint, it's one of the premier assessments out there.
Yeah, so let's break that down for people. So the HPI is the bright side, right? The day-to-day strengths that a leader might have. Then the HDS is what are their derailers when they're working
The dark side.
Under stress. I love the dark side. Dun, dun, dun. And then MVPI is what are their drivers and, values? Is it a good fit for where, the company is at as well? Anything you would add to any of those three?
Cognitive ability, is a pretty good predictor of success in a structured interview. Those combined, like if I was to go in and be charged with creating a robust executive assessment process, I would start with personality. I would use cognitive ability, maybe a situational judgment test, and a performance competency-based structured interview. And I'd go in and talk about, okay, with some of the other leaders, what does success look like for a leader in this organization? What do people that are unsuccessful look like? Also, let's dig into that and make sure that, we're avoiding bad behaviors while making sure we're identifying the good behaviors associated with success. I think that is a pretty robust way to at least start for an executive level assessment. I don't know that I would add a whole lot more unless it was just kind of a unique org culture, team fit kind of analysis there.
Yeah. And I want to spend a little time on a word that you said earlier, performance. So how do you separate potential from performance then when it comes to assessments?
Good question. And, we help people with what we call HiPo identification, high potential identification. And it's exactly that, right? So you can be a really good performer in role. And we're talking about the Peter principle here, or what I was talking about earlier, what is the difference between leadership emergence versus actual effectiveness, right? So these things diverge a bit. And I see it a lot in engineering and sales, where you have a really good performer in role and they get promoted, but they don't have that performance competency. Their behavior base rate doesn't align with people management as well, right? So how do you do that? I would start with a competency model at the targeted job role to define what does good look like here, right? What does performance look like? Let's measure that really well. And we can align assessment tools to hire people into them. Then when we're working with restaurants a lot right now, so it's critical for them to have a pipeline from general manager into multi-unit manager, for example. And it's a much easier transition from an assistant restaurant manager into a general manager role than it is from a general manager to a multi-unit, because it's just such a different job. I mean, there's considerable overlap across all of these, but at the multi-unit level, really, really talking with those leaders and defining what success looks like for that, and aligning your assessment strategy for your internal promotes and external hires for that role is critical, because the potential for the next role does not always have the same behavior patterns as performance in role. Essentially,
that's right. Big difference. I mean, what makes me think of is like, what about a shark of a salesperson who just nails it? They're so good with clients and bringing in new business and all of that. So you promote them up to be a manager, and now they have to like manage people, and they're like, I don't know how to do any of this. This doesn't, so you think you're hiring the right person because the shark will just teach other sharks, but that person needs to have the ability and skill set and interest to train, develop, and mentor others, right? Which is not always an inherent skill.
No, you're absolutely right. I don't want to go down on too much of a rabbit hole here, but I've done some really good research on personality prediction of sales performance for both subjective ratings and objective outcomes. And beyond that, curvilinearity on those specific traits. And if there's a curvilinear relationship to those outcomes as well. And what we see is, in general, we saw kind of two behavioral patterns emerge for success for salespeople. And one of those is kind of your prototypical, what everybody is archetype of a salesperson is. It's the used car salesman, pushy, persistent sales. And people are successful at doing that. Maybe not in every organization, but it's correlated. That pattern is associated with good performance. On the other side, what we find is people highly, highly conscientious that aren't as extroverted, that listen really well, take detailed notes. That's the next path to being a really good salesperson, actually. People don't think about that. One of the best salespeople I ever was associated with, I wouldn't say she was necessarily introverted, but she wasn't extroverted either. Maureen Tarantello, give a shout out to Maureen. She was wonderful at account management. She listened so well to her clients and would let kind of the expert client delivery people, she'd bring them in to really shine and explain the details, be the subject matter expert. And she just listened so well and come in and ask the right question at the right time to really uncover what the client was trying to really solve, And anyway, so there's so interesting to me that those behavior patterns emerge from that. there's other stuff in the curvilinearity, but I don't want to get too far off topic there.
That's okay. So, with assessments as a whole, when should boards and recruiters actually use the assessments? Is it better to do it before they have their interviews or after the interviews? I mean, I'm sure you're going to say perhaps, maybe, depends. But what's your take on that?
The joke within my community, it depends is the default answer for everything, right? It's like, it depends on what industry and like what level, and so. And it does, but I would say, by and large, I do assessments across levels in the organization, but more times than not, organizations are really focused on that middle management role. So like junior level manager to senior director, for the most part, to do selection assessments. And it just depends on the strategy, right? So are you trying to select in or select out people, for one? Right? Are you trying to screen people out to then get them in for, and use the assessment to screen them out to then get them in for an interview? Or are you putting the assessment further along in the process where you have your recruiters do your initial resume scans and screens on their end, maybe an initial 15, 30-minute screening interview? Then it's like, okay, now let's have the assessment, and then they continue with the selection hiring process. And I always recommend having the assessment before the serious interviews, right? After it gets past the recruiter. Because what's so valuable about the assessments in themselves are valuable. But where the rubber really hits the road with that is like, you're able to use that information in the interviews. We've constructed our interviews to augment that, right? Or our assessments, rather. It has a structured interview with it. And you can find out, okay, well, we're hiring this person into this high stress role, but they're really low in stress tolerance. Like, let's ask them about that in the follow-up interview, some behavioral based questions on what's your experience when you've had something, blow up on you at work, and how did you handle that? And so digging a little bit deeper, help you ascertain and compare across the other candidates. Maybe you have another candidate that's also low in stress tolerance. And that interview, how do you feel about how they might handle it in the future if you hire them, compared to both how they've handled it in the past, essentially? So, really,
that's really, it's interesting to say it in that way, and it makes a lot of sense to me, because then you can start to really dive into the pieces that you prioritize, or skills or traits that are 100% necessary, and maybe that person doesn't have it, or maybe they didn't test, or it didn't come through in the assessment itself. Because I think. Here's my thought, and I'm just going to say the quiet thing out loud. What about the people that are filling out these assessments going, okay, what do they think they want as a CEO or a CFO or whatever? So I'm just going to answer it in the way I think they think we want it. And so then where is the validity there?
You touch on a pain point of assessments and what we call impression management.
Simplify that, Brandon.
I'll try my best. So it's a constant problem, and people have tried to solve that in various ways through test construction. So you have what are called normative assessments, where it's behavioral statements with a Likert scale, right? Agreement scale. Mm-hmm. By and large, that's what most assessments have. Those are, we'll say, easier to fake good. Okay. Then you have other assessments. A lot of the assessments, like the Myers-Briggs DISC tools and StrengthsFinder, use an ipsative format for most of their tools, where it's a forced choice is what ipsative is. It's like 2, 3, 4 sometimes behavioral statements, and you say, this one's most like me out of these 4. This one's least like me. People really don't like that format as much as a test taker, because sometimes you get presented with, 3 behavioral statements. You're like, none of these are like me at all, or maybe all of them are. It's very hard to choose, and it doesn't seem fair in a way. But it's much more difficult to fake good using that format. That's not without its challenges too, because without a normative-based database, you really have a tough time getting the third C, that criterion-related validity. And in fact, the Myers-Briggs and all those class of assessments, which I would probably call typology-based tests,
Yep.
It's usually buried in the back of their technical manual. Do not use this assessment for hiring or selection talent decisions. It's because they lack that kind of higher level validation, essentially. Think there's a great place for those tools in team building and some of the employee development and some of those things. I would just never use any of that to make a talent decision. And it just even opens you up for maybe even some legal trouble if you use it
For sure.
improperly.
Absolutely
But,
no Myers-Briggs on the pre-hire assessment whatsoever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And, I also think about the candidate experience as well. I mean, when you're at an executive level, you know that it's going to be a long and drawn out process. You're expecting it. But I also wonder in the flow of things, you want to make sure that the candidate is warm through the whole process, right? They may be exploring multiple opportunities at the same time. You want to be pacing at the same time with the other opportunities they might have on table. And you want to make sure that you're not wasting their time, right? Like that's the big one. You don't want your candidate to be exhausted. Oh my God, they're giving me another interview, another assessment, another case study, because that leaves a bad impression on their mind for, again, I think about employee experience. It was a marathon to even get into role. And now I'm here, I'm exhausted. I think that's the last thing you want, right?
Well, of course. And it's curvilinear in a lot of ways. And there's a whole body of literature on candidate experience. And I've done some research in that area as well. And I can touch on that. But you're absolutely right. You want, especially at the executive level, you don't want to just hire people willy-nilly,
Right.
because that's not good for your company. But also, there's probably an increase in the executive applicants' perception on how serious it is and how well of a job you're doing in the selection process with how much they care about the role. And that goes for just not at the executive level, across multiple levels for their perceptions on the candidate process. But if you put somebody through months and months of interviews and things like that at the executive level, like you're competing for that talent at the same time. You're trying to sell them the job in a lot of ways too, right? So you want that to be a good experience for them. You want them to know that you're taking it seriously and want to make the right decision for your company because they want to go work for a company that takes things seriously and want to do a good, right thing. But it can be overdone.
Yeah. Which kind of leads me to my next question of, how can HR better explain this process clearly to all the stakeholders? There's the candidate, but then there's also the others that are involved in the interviewing process. I imagine that your company does a lot of strategic planning of thinking about the interview process as a whole, steps 1 through 2, 3, 4, 5, beyond. But how can HR better explain it to everyone so that everyone's on the same page?
They need to first build out a set process that's known by the whole talent acquisition team and all their hiring managers. It's hard to re-educate hiring managers a lot. They're not always doing that.
Yeah.
But always putting that in front of them, setting the expectation of like, we have a 7-step process: resume screen, phone screen, assessment, interview, background check, reference check, hire, however that looks.
Yeah.
But making sure that you set expectations and educate everybody up front, make sure that you're setting expectations and educating the applicants, the candidates, like what they can expect and how long it should take. It's frustrating to me working with, especially on frontline management roles. Recruiters are always like, they say assessments are too long a lot of times, and it takes some of these, 5, 10, 15 minutes. But what we have learned from a lot of the HR tech companies is a lot of times the lag comes from the handoff between the talent acquisition team and the hiring manager sometimes. So there's too big of a lag in the communication back and forth. A lot of times people without information about what's coming next, they assume the worst.
Yeah. And that's not a great experience for anybody across the board, right? I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but I really want people to, if you're curious about the work that Brandon does out in the world, go to our show notes over at thesimplifiers.com. That's where you can find links to his site, his LinkedIn, and all the good things that ForPsyte are doing out in the world, because I feel like it seems so simple on the face, like it's just a couple of assessments, no big deal. But now when we really dig into it, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are thinking too, there's a lot of pre-planning, a lot of strategic planning going into play before you even go to hire a candidate. You need to know what the skills are. You need to know what the workflow of the interview process will be. And I imagine that there's just a lot of pre-work that needs to get done beforehand. And I imagine also that clients come to you, Brandon, and go, "We need to hire this role tomorrow. So get with it." So yeah. If you're curious about Brandon, head over to our show notes, thesimplifiers.com, and link up with him there. So Brandon, as we wrap up, there's a few questions I like to ask everyone that comes on the podcast. So here we go, rapid fire. First question is this: what's one book or blog that you're reading these days that's either inspiring you or poking holes and challenging your belief system?
Well, by virtue of my role in my own organization here, I'm often involved in sales, and I am not a salesperson. I am a psychologist and psychometrician and, management consultant. And I've always been involved in sales, but I've had to develop a lot of sales skills as a leader. And I'm currently reading Robert Cialdini's Influence, and speaks to me because he's a psychologist, and he really summarizes a lot of the existing research, psychological research around influence and sales and perceptions and things like that. So I think that's been really helpful for me to develop myself.
Awesome. Well, we'll link that up in the show notes if you guys are curious about it. Again, you can go over to thesimplifiers.com and find that book there. So I believe that gratitude and simplicity go hand in hand. Tell me, what are you grateful for today?
I'm grateful for my health today. I know we had to reschedule this because I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I hurt my back last week and had to reschedule this. So very fortunate. I'm feeling more and more fortunate every day that I have my health. But I mean, it's my family and friends, and I'm living in the Dallas area here, and I don't know. It'd take a pretty big stack of dynamite to blow me out of the Dallas area to be away from friends and family, and I care for them tremendously.
I feel that as well. Yeah. Tell me, who is somebody in your network, somebody you know personally that you just feel is up to brilliant things? If we were to shine a spotlight on them, who would you recommend? Maybe, who knows, one day we'll have them on the podcast. Who would that be?
I have a good friend of mine that works at IBM. Like, I respect him tremendously. And he actually just emailed me this morning. His name's Jeff Labrador. We work together at Connexa and IBM. And he's doing some really interesting work in the AI space with leadership assessment with the companies he's with. He's with a small startup right now, and they're doing some really cool stuff. He's just a great guy, and respect him.
Love it. Well, we'll link Jeff up in the show notes for people if you guys are curious about what he's doing out in the world as well. And again, you guys can find Brandon at the show notes. Send him a message on LinkedIn, say hello. I'm sure he would love to geek out with you about talent assessments as well. So Brandon, my final question for you is this: someone and somewhere is listening to you and I right now, and they're thinking, man, maybe they're a recruiter, and they're thinking, yeah, I really should know more about assessments, and I don't feel like I know enough to be knowledgeable. What's one thing you could whisper in their ear just to encourage them in this moment?
Do sign up for HR Southwest. We'll be speaking on employee assessments there, and you can learn so much more. I might whisper that, but I would say what is great these days on just research is just using AI. ChatGPT is amazing, and go ask ChatGPT about products and services, and some of the things we talked about today. And it can help you ascertain, like, is the assessment I'm using right now good? Does it have, the three C's of validity and things like that.
Yeah.
How does it compare to other things on, I've done market research for our own company in that way. So I'm using these AI tools to really educate myself.
I love that. I could totally see putting in a prompt like, coach me on the top 5 executive assessment tools that are out there. What are the pros and cons of each? And what are things that I should look for before selecting the right assessment for this specific hire? And then import the job description. And that would give you a real research data-based assessment of assessments. So yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, it's great.
Brandon, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you. Thanks for having me.